So question number 7, and that is, since Jesus turned water into wine, is it wrong to drink wine? And so I think that a lot of times people might get a little bit confused. They'll say, well, wait a minute. If you look at the Bible says that you're not supposed to drink, but yet Jesus turned the water into wine. And so does that mean that it's okay to drink at certain events? It kind of brings up a lot of different questions. But when we kind of take a look at this and we understand a little bit more about what the Bible has to say about alcohol, then it kind of all runs in together and makes a little bit more sense to us, okay? And so the story where Jesus turned water into wine is in John chapter 2. And you remember that this was the very first miracle that Jesus did. Jesus had been in Jerusalem. Jesus had left Jerusalem in Judea with his disciples that he had just kind of gathered up. And by the way, Jesus' disciples didn't always follow him, especially in the very beginning of his ministry. In the very beginning of his ministry, there was only 5 of them, to tell you the truth. And so, we think about the 12 disciples. That didn't happen until later on in Jesus' ministry. But these 6 men followed Jesus from Judea up through back where he was from in Galilee, and we see that Jesus attended this feast. Now, there's a couple of safe assumptions here, and that is, assumption number 1 is that we think that Jesus was already invited to the feast, and that it was his plan to come and hit it on the way home back to Galilee. You remember Mary, his mother, was with him, by the way. Okay, that's an important part. But since Jesus just came across these disciples, then they're the wedding crashers, so to speak. They're not really invited to the feast, but they're there. Okay, so that's a little bit of an assumption. Maybe we need to factor into this little story. Something else we need to understand about the story is the custom of the day. So the custom of the day is that this is not a one-day event. It's not, marriage in the afternoon, that's it. Oftentimes this would have been the ending process, something that would oftentimes take a year to complete. And so at the year when this marriage was finally, finalized, if you will, you got the bride that would go from her parents' house. There would be a procession. All of her friends were there. They would be carrying lamps. They'd be carrying palm branches. They'd be, dancing and singing everything, and going to her new husband's place. And then that's when the final marriage contracts and marriage vows were signed. And then there would be a big feast that would be there for the family and friends. Sometimes this would be a couple of days. Sometimes this would be a week. It depended on how well off the groom's family was. Now, according to the custom of the day, people were very sensitive about being hospitable. If you were not hospitable to people, then that was a big shame and big reproach upon your family. And so here comes Jesus with his mother, with the other disciples for this feast. And as they were there, we see that Mary turns to Jesus and says, they have run out of wine. Okay, well, that's going to be a huge embarrassment on the family because of the custom of the day. And this is where that little assumption comes in of whether Jesus and Mary were invited, but the other disciples were not. Because if Jesus and Mary were invited, then, the host would have had preparation. But, if all of a sudden these other men were there, then it's kind of like, where did these guys come from, right? And even if, it wasn't their fault, people kind of might even kind of say, hey, it's Jesus and his disciples' fault. All right? And so when Mary came up to Jesus and said, they have no more wine, you can kind of see maybe a little bit about what she was saying here is, Jesus, you need to take care of this situation. To which Jesus said, it's not my time. And it really was not his time. But at the same time, I kind of believe that, first of all, he knew, loved, and respected his mother. And secondly, he kind of understood the situation, the circumstance of the day. And so Jesus had the servants go and take 6 clay jars or stone jars where the ceremonial water was kept, and then fill it to the brim. And then Jesus went and drew out and said, "Draw it out and take it to the master of the ceremonies." And he came and he tasted and he said, "You know, you saved the best for last. Usually you get the bad stuff at the end, but you've got the good wine now." And you know, and so that was the miracle. Okay, and so the question is, okay, if Jesus turned the water into wine, is that meaning that Jesus says that it is okay to drink wine, and is it okay to get drunk? Well, first of all, we need to understand what wine was back in that day and time compared to wine in this day and time. I don't know the alcoholic content of wine back then compared to wine now. I've kind of read that the wine back then was of lesser alcoholic content than the wine now, from the way that they made the wine. If I were to say, "Hey, this is the case," then somebody who has expertise in winemaking would come back on me and say, "Nope, you're wrong." And so I'm not even going to go there. But this is the case. What they did back then was they diluted their wine with water. I mean, that was a common practice. That was a common practice among the Gentiles and a common practice among the Jews as well. And if you stop and think about it, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you think about the effort that it's going to take to go and grow grapes, to harvest the grapes, to go and then harvest the juice, and then to make the wine itself, you're going to want to stretch that out just a little bit. Okay? Especially when you understand that wine was not just simply something to drink. Oftentimes what they would do is they'd take wine and they would mix it in with water, sometimes even up to 20 parts water to 1 part wine, in order to purify the water. Okay? And so, you know, we're kind of thinking today about turn on the spigot, you get clean water out. But imagine living back then at that time, and you're getting water, you know, from well out of the ground. You might get good water. You might get some water that's, you know, not so good, especially if the water's been sitting around for a while, right? And so, you know, how are you going to make that water safe to drink? Well, you could boil it, but again, you know, if you're talking about back in that day and time where you've got wood, you've got fire, you've got everything, I mean, that's kind of a little bit hard to do. And so it just goes back to the, you know, the idea about you take a little bit of wine and you put it into the water and it purifies the water. By the way, did you know that the Pilgrims, when they were coming to America, they took grog with them? And the reason why they took grog with them is because they put it in their drinking water on the vessel to help. Grog. It's alcoholic, strong alcoholic drink. Right? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, and somebody who is groggy, it's because they've had too much grog to drink. Okay? Okay. So, yeah, she's on her way. Okay, but anyway, so, you know, that was just simply a practice in that day and time, okay? And so, so if you wanted to have water or wine, you know, actually drinking wine, hi, you're coming to see me, aren't you? I know, she's fast. So if you're going to have wine, what they do is they'd mix it, and sometimes it would be like 6-to-1 ratio, 3-to-1 ratio. Anything that was more than a 3-to-1 ratio, whether it was 2-to-1 or 1-to-1, it was considered strong drink. And so in the Old Testament, you sometimes read about wine and strong drink, and you think, okay, what is that strong drink? That strong drink is wine, but it's actually either straight wine or wine that's 1-to-1 water and wine. You know, sometimes on that strong drink, what they do is they put herbs in it to kind of accentuate the effects of the alcohol. But when you take a look in the Old Testament, strong drink was very, very much forbidden. And oftentimes when you look at Judaistic customs of that day, the rabbis would not bless the wine if it was more than or less than 3-to-1 ratio. Okay, they'd say, nope, that's unclean. I'm not doing it. And so what I'm trying to say is that this wine that was taken to this master of ceremonies, you got to understand that this wine is going to be very weak, and the people there are not. This is not a sloppy, fallen down, drunk party, so to speak. Okay, the people of that day and time, especially the Jews of Judea and Galilee, they're pretty moral people. That would have been something that the Gentiles would have done. And so, number one, the wine that was there was probably very low in alcohol to begin with, but then you water it down, and so that's what we've got. Okay, and so as far as drinking alcohol. Is it wrong to drink alcohol? Well, as long as somebody's not getting drunk, that's the idea. The prohibitions in the New Testament is that you just don't get drunk, okay? But there's other factors to consider as well. And that is, first of all, you've got to think about, conscience. And on Sunday morning, we've been talking about matters of conscience in Romans chapters 14 and 15. And that is something that's very real. And that is, if somebody is going to drink some alcohol, and even though it's going to be mixed 20-to-1, so to speak, and even though they're not going to get drunk, but it's something that their conscience is telling them don't do, then they don't need to do it. Because as Paul said in Romans chapter 14, that anything that you believe is sin, it is to you, and so don't do it. And then there's something else, and that is you got to take into consideration the conscience of other people as well. And that is that, especially if your fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, if they're going to be offended by it, well, you don't need to do it. You just need to leave it alone. And, something else, and that is you got to think about your witness. If you're thinking, well, hey, I'm not doing anything wrong, but if somebody who is a non-believer sees it and somehow that's going to affect your Christian witness and testimony to them, you just got to think, is it worth my effectiveness in the cause of Christ to do that? And so there's other things to consider. And something else to consider is why somebody would do it to begin with. Personally, I think wine tastes terrible. Give me water instead. I'd rather not taste it. So for me, if somebody were to give me a glass of wine, I would not drink it because of the taste. There may be a reason why I want to drink it, because it just, I'd have a tendency to fit in, or I might look cool or something like that. And then you got the issues of, if that's the motivation for drinking, then that's worldliness, okay? And so there's a lot of things that go into this, isn't it? It's not just simply a really easy thing. But anyway, Jesus turned into the water into the wine. When you look at the customs of the day, no, that does not just simply say, yeah, it's okay to go have a drunken party at somebody's wedding. Okay? All right. You got any questions about that?